raise your hand in the participant panel, and we'll do our best to answer questions throughout, but we definitely have time at the end. And so I think it's a really good place to just begin our discussion of Harvard University finances with a topic that's on everyone's mind and everyone has been impacted in more than one way over the past year, and how has it impacted our finances? So we just want to start off by saying recessions and economic shocks are a normal part of the business cycle. You can see here, if we look outside of higher education, we have had a recession in almost every decade in recent history. Some are bigger than others, but they all have impacted Harvard in different ways. And so in some of these ways, there has been reduced federal funding for research, or decreased giving, or reduced endowment returns, which impacts our finances. And as we work through the presentation, you'll see how Harvard prepares for it and what we're doing to currently deal with the current crisis on hand. So COVID-19 is just another example of our crisis, and we'll call out in different areas specific COVID information for you and how it's impacted our revenues and expenses and how we're responding in different ways. So we do just want to call out just COVID-19, and it will be a big part of the presentation. So our goal with the course, we have it broken into 3 sections. We have an organizational context, a financial context, and then a higher ed industry context. And with those 3 buckets, we want you to take away 6 concepts. So the first is that Harvard's mission is to excel in teaching and research, and the institution spends its resources accordingly. Harvard University is also a very large, complex, and decentralized organization. Our teaching and research activities generate less than half of the university's total revenue, requiring additional diversification of revenues. The endowment is a unique asset that is meant to last forever and has spending restrictions. It's not designed to serve as a rainy day fund. Cost containment is especially challenging in higher education, given the increasing fixed costs, which include student needs, government compliance requirements, and the desire to pay staff competitively, for example. And then lastly, Harvard has many advantages, but it's not isolated from the competitive pressures and higher education industry headwinds. So with that, we'll jump into the organizational context. I think it's a really important place to start to figure out how the finances follow along the organization. So Harvard has 12 schools or academic institutions. So here are our 12 schools. What I will call out, I did see we have a couple people from GSAS. So GSAS and DCE, or the Division of Continuing Education, are included in FAS, which also houses the college. And then the rest lists all of our different schools and units. So with this group, you have representation from all of the schools. So you kind of know the schools pretty well. One I will call out is Radcliffe. Radcliffe does not have students, but we do still consider it one of our primary academic units. So Harvard by the numbers, we talked about our 12 academic units. In terms of people, we have over 21,000 degree candidates. There are 2,400 instructional faculty. We have over 18,000 employees across the university. And space, there are over 650 buildings. We have 70 libraries and 19 million volumes. And then we have over 5,000 acres. And this land is not just in Boston or Allston, Cambridge, Boston. We have New Jersey, in Italy. We also have different land. And so with this, we just want to show you how vast Harvard can be. It's a very large and complex place. And depending on where you sit, your perspective on what Harvard is can be very different. With these 12 primary units, it's very decentralized, meaning that decisions and resources are made at the local level. We'll go into this idea of local level or ETOB, every tub on its own bottom shortly. But this is very different than many of our peer institutions, where many decisions and resources are controlled at the central level. So when we look at Harvard, Harvard University can be understood as an umbrella organization that houses many, many organizations, including schools and units, and the central operating units, which includes financial administration, where David and I sit. And then there's also university housing, which is a fee-for-service unit. So when we have the umbrella institute, or we have Harvard as the umbrella, you can see all of these different mini organizations that make up what Harvard is. So we'll start with the pink area. The pink area are schools and units, which we consider ETOB. And that means, so ETOB is every tub on its own bottom. And what that means is the schools and units must be self-sustaining. So you'll note, we'll come back to this point throughout the presentation. ETOB makes Harvard, Harvard. It was actually coined in, you can see at the bottom, the footnote, in the early 1800s from President Kirkland. And it's the way we've heard it, I would say from an administration side, it can make life a little more complex and complicated, but it is beautiful in a way that it allows research and teaching to move further faster because decisions can be made at these local levels. So that's something that we want to call out. The pink, so our schools and units make up about 80% of our operations. And that's kind of the ETOB. And then the other 20% is central administration and fee-for-service units. So our central administration is funded by assessments, or what we call taxes, where the schools have to help pay for the services that our general counsel provides, or for the president and provost office for FAD, the financial administration where we sit in OFSP. And then we have fee-for-service units. And this includes dining services or transportation. And these units compete with outside vendors, and they must be self-sustaining as well. So the fee-for-service units charge our schools for the services that they provide. And then lastly, on this slide, who is OFSP? So why are we here? What do we help with? We are a central finance office partnering with schools and units, as well as the president and provost and EVP, supporting the CFO. So we build relationships, we convene stakeholders and generate ideas. We support the annual financial planning process, which includes the budget, multi-year and tuition setting. And then we also help conduct special projects, which can include capital project affordability or cost containment strategies as well. So that's kind of who we are and the organization itself. Before we move on to the finances, are there any questions about the organization, about Harvard and its organizational context? All right.
Okay, we can jump right into our financial context section, which is the biggest part of tonight's session. And we'd like to start off with just some key terms and sort of where they come from. So on the next slide, you'll see this is a picture of the annual report that we provided everybody a link to. There's no requirement at all that you go and read it or try to read it now, but it's something that every college and nonprofit has to publish in some form or another. And they all kind of look the same. So the things that we're going to be covering tonight in terms of key terms, Kath, if you'll click the next one, it'll show where they show up on this 2 pages of the annual report. You could find the same terms and the same information in anyone else's annual report too. So we'll be talking about revenue, expense, operating results. We'll go into restricted a little bit, and then we'll have capital expenditures as well. So this really is just to point out that, you know, these things are right there in our financials, and you can find them in other people's financials if you just become burningly curious after tonight's session. So let's talk a little bit about what each of those terms mean before we dive too far in, because we're going to be saying them a lot. And I want to make sure that we all understand what each one means. So the first one is operating revenues, and that's fairly straightforward. It's just the money that's generated by the primary activities that we undertake. Money that comes from teaching, from research, from some auxiliaries, whatever else is going on. Operating expenses is just the money that we spend to conduct those activities. You know, this covers three giant categories as we often talk about them. It's people, stuff, and space. That's what we spend money on. The next one, operating result, is very simply just the difference between the two. In the for-profit world, this might be operating margin or net margin or something along those lines. But as we'll talk about later, we treat that money a little bit differently. And so we call it operating result because it's the outcome of 1 year's operations, just the difference between revenue and expense in that year. Next up is restricted. So what restricted means is basically that we are required to keep track of where money comes from. And in many cases, we're only allowed to use money from a certain source on a certain thing. A really easy example of this for those of you who might be in the research heavy schools is the federal government gives us a grant to do a certain research project. We can only spend that money on that project. That's sort of the most restricted version, but it also comes in other places as well, as we'll see later on in the presentation. And then finally, we'll talk about capital expenditures. This is a different category of expenses that we'll talk about just briefly. But whereas the operating revenue and expense is sort of what it takes to run our day-to-day operations of what we do, the teaching and research, capital expenditures are expenditures on big projects that are sort of outside the scope of a single year that you wouldn't really do every year. And the easiest example, and by far the most common, is buildings. You know, creating new buildings, maintaining our buildings, renovating, that all falls into this category where it's sort of bigger than 1 year's operations, and the result from doing that lasts longer. You know, the benefit from doing that lasts longer. So let's go right into university revenue. So this slide gives us a look at the different sources of revenue at the university, and they fall into four main buckets. The first one is education. And yeah, these two sort of they're all blue, but the medium-ish blue ones are the education functions. There's two pieces of that: traditional education, net tuition, which is from degree granting programs for the most part, and then continuing and executive education that is non-degree granting, ongoing education kinds of things. The next category here is research in the slightly lighter blue. This is sponsored research that's paid for by federal and non-federal sponsors. And what we'd like to point out here is that these are our two main lines of business that we've already talked about a couple of times, teaching and research. They only provide collectively about, what is this, 34%, I think it is, I have to redo my math, of the university's total revenue. Everything else has to come from somewhere else. So then the next big category, the one that jumps out on this page, is philanthropy. That comes in two forms: endowment distributions, that's income that's generated by the university's endowment. We'll talk about that more. And then current use gifts, which is money given within 1 year, usually intended to be spent in a short period of time. And again, we'll go into all this in more detail. The final category up top is other. And there's a lot of other in other, but some of it is pretty small. Some of it is really big in certain places. Like if you work at Harvard, or if you work or spend much time at Harvard Business School Publishing, HBP, publications is a very big deal there. But at other parts of the university, it's a very small one. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and we don't cover it in as much detail, not because it isn't important, but because there's a lot of little individual pieces of things going on, and we simply don't have the time to go through all of them. So we're certainly happy to answer particular questions about these, but for the most part, we're going to focus on the others. And the rest of the financial, the next several sections of the financial context part of the class will go through these revenue sources in more detail. Before we do that, we wanted to pause, and this is sort of our first COVID-specific content. We wanted to pause and talk about the impact of COVID on revenue. If you've paid attention to things that came out of the president's office and other, Tom Hollister, the CFO's office, particularly about a year ago now, you would have seen a lot of talk about the impact on revenue. As Kath mentioned earlier, the current crisis is really, in some ways, obviously there's a lot of impacts, but in strictly financial terms, it works a lot like some other recessions do. This is a normal part of a business cycle. So for comparison here, what we've done is we're showing some of the impacts from the prior recession. We call it the Great Recession. This is the Great Financial Crisis, whatever name you want to give it. And from 09 to 010 is when Harvard really felt the impact here. And it came across in a couple of categories you can probably eyeball from this graph, but we'll go ahead and highlight them here. Working from the bottom up, the endowment distribution went down because the capital markets took a big hit in the last recession. Current use gifts went down, probably for about the same reason. Wealthy donors found themselves not quite as wealthy. Traditional net tuition went up. One of the things that has been true in most recessions is that people take advantage of an opportunity to invest in their future. They go to grad school. So sometimes it's not that unusual for enrollment to go up during a recession. And then the last one that went up significantly was federal sponsored. This largely was a result of the federal government using federal research as a stimulus lever to pull. There was this act called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that put a lot of money into federally sponsored research, and Harvard got some of that to do some of that research. So that's the 2007 through 2009 kind of one. Now let's pull up what we know so far about COVID-19, and you'll see that we haven't really marked an endpoint for this yet because we don't know how far the effects might be felt financially or otherwise. But for contrast, this is FY19, which was totally unaffected by COVID, and then FY20, which about a third of it was affected by COVID. And if we put the same percentages up for this, where the highlights are, in this case, we saw distributions from the endowment go up. We'll talk about why exactly that is, but it really comes down to timing. Distributions in the endowment are set far enough in advance that they were already done by the time COVID started. Continuing executive education went down because a lot of Harvard's programs were conducted on campus, and we suddenly found ourselves unable to use our campus for the most part. And then other went down. We talked about other a little bit and how there's a lot of little pieces in it. The one that really matters here is board and lodging. All the undergraduate students went home. They received refunds for the unused portion of their board payments. There were other supports provided in this category by various graduate schools. So that's the biggest piece, but there are some other things in here, like publications did take a hit and some other things that are more campus dependent. So we show this basically to say that in some ways, recessions are pretty similar. You see certain revenue categories that are particularly sensitive to the capital markets or to other kinds of operations. But in some ways, this one's kind of different. We've never had a recession before whose impact mainly came from its impact on our physical campus. Previous ones have had to do with capital markets primarily. This one, the impacts really ended up coming more from our inability to use the campus itself, which is kind of undiscovered country. In the future, we'll have a much better grasp on what the overall impacts are through the whole course of the pandemic, but we thought it was important to sort of mention it here because it does have such a big impact on revenue so far. So the next thing we'll talk about revenue in general before we dive into the categories is it varies a lot by what part of Harvard you're in. This graph shows Harvard's 12 primary academic units, and we have them arranged, and we'll move the gray box in the middle in a moment. We have them arranged to show the different funding structures. So you see those revenue buckets on the left with the different colors, and then each school has a different combination of them. So for one extreme, you have Radcliffe on the far left. They get 85% of their revenue from the endowment. And that means that they're extremely sensitive to the capital markets, but not as much to some other things like executive education. They just don't do that. On the far right, at the other end, is the School of Public Health. They have the least dependence on the endowment at 19%, they're at the bottom, but they do have the biggest dependence on sponsored research, that lighter blue is 61%. So they have a very different mix of revenues and therefore a different mix of risks when things go wrong. And then if we clear out the gray box, you can see that all the other schools fall in between. There's a lot of different structures. You can sort of become mesmerized by this and stare at it. And you maybe spot the ones that are more balanced, the ones that have different big pieces of this or that and the other. But the main point we want to make is that the schools are all different. This is ETOB, every tub on its own bottom. And so they all have their own revenue profiles. And that means they are all affected differently by changes in capital markets, pandemics, et cetera.
One other thing I want to add in, you can see the numbers at the top of the chart, and those numbers are the total revenue for each school. So we're just looking at it, each bar is 100% what makes up their total revenue, but you can see the varied revenue by school at the very top of the chart as well.
Good point, Kath. I always forget that, always.
So before we start diving into some of our big revenue categories, any questions about the organizational context or about kind of the portion that David just presented on total revenue, as well as driven by school. So Brett, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I know Mark on here, he and we spent a lot of time in the student government in South Dakota State University, and we really got to just dive into historical data. It's a little bit of a different structure being a state funded thing, but you saw such stark differences over the decades where they really had to turn up the heat on alumni generation as well as tuition. Kind of like historically over the last decades, have you seen much of a shift in a similar nature at all between some of these different boxes?
We have. It might be a slight oversimplification, but in broad terms, it's over the last 20 years, we've seen philanthropy become a greater percentage of our revenue and education and research become a smaller percent. We've looked at that because we were sort of curious. We've gone through 2 big recessions in the last 20 years. There's been booms and busts. We've looked at that, and it's true. It has changed. I couldn't say off the top of my head how much it might have changed, say, since 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But at least recently, we're seeing this shift towards more philanthropic and less research and teaching funding.
Another area is executive education. I would say that's been a trend that we've seen pick up over the last several years of an opportunity for many of the schools that they've also been kind of leaning in to executive education. And I think it's a great question of, is there an ideal state? And I don't think so. So I think a couple to call out, like I think there's always headwinds and tailwinds depending on what makes up your revenue. But like the Kennedy School, HKS is, you can see pretty evenly distributed across the different categories. And so that can bring advantages and disadvantages when there can be a downturn in some ways. If it's impacting one source of revenue, they still have others that are coming in. But there's not. I think the schools are continuously challenging themselves as to, do we need to diversify more? Do we need to lean into our current structure? And so I would say yes to David's point of, we have seen changes more on the philanthropy side, but also the continuing exec ed side, and schools are continuing to figure out what is the best proportion for our revenue. And that will continue to change over time as well.
See, we've got a question in the chat, and I see that Rachel has her hand up, but our question in the chat from William kind of ties nicely into this. So he was asking, does revenue move across schools if one school runs a deficit? Would one of you like to grab that one?
Oh, sure. So we'll talk a little bit more about surpluses, but everything stays within your tub. So going back that every tub on its own bottom, revenue will stay within whatever tub brings the money in. We have seen collaborations across schools and units where there may be a joint program between the business school and the School of Public Health. And so they'll allocate tuition or they'll allocate some revenue that's brought in, but every revenue stays within each school.
We should say that for the most part, when we say tub so casually, we mean school, or sometimes one of the big non-school units. But
yeah.
Tub and school are functionally equivalent when we go through that quickly.
So Rachel in GSAS had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, how does the share of the endowment get passed out? Because I'm assuming each school has its own alumni base from which it, milks various donor contributions. But my assumption is also that the endowment is managed centrally, and that each school gets a piece of it, and that how is that allocation decision happen?
I can take this one, although the endowment's coming up soon, so I'm going to do a light answer. And if we still have questions after doing the endowment, we can come back to this. So raise your hand again. But a couple things there. We'll talk about how the amount of money is decided on in a future slide. But the endowment is made up of thousands of funds, over 13,000 funds. And each fund has kind of a designation depending on, it has a different purpose. Some of those purposes are restricted to the university in general, but more often they'll be restricted very specifically and based on each school or unit's portfolio of funds. That's how their share gets determined. There's a lot more to talk about there, but I'm going to wait till we have some more of the building blocks on a future slide, and then definitely raise your hand again if you have more questions there. I see Joshua has a question.
Yes, hi. First, thank you guys so much for coming, and we'll thank you again at the end. I was curious, it came from the earlier slides, but tuition comes in, that's also different across each school. So does tuition go directly to the individual school that is collecting it, or is that also pooled in some way, and therefore sort of who's responsible for that?
It goes directly to the school that sets it. That's a key part of the ETOB model, is that each school sets their own tuition, collects their own tuition, keeps it. So the only case where Kathy might know better, but the only case where I think that would normally be shared is in one of these joint degree programs where there's a sort of a deal between two schools to make some split in the revenue for that program.
Yeah, yep, that's exactly right. And I think that's actually a great segue into our next section. So thank you, Jojo, for leading us there. We're going to talk a little bit about.
Oh, sorry, could I'm a co-host, so I can't raise my hand, but could I just quickly follow up on that question? So I just want to speak for some of the reps that we've heard questions about this across the year, but we've heard from certain reps that when they have approached their local school, I guess, leadership or administration and asked about things like allocation of funds or changes in tuition, they've been told that it isn't controlled by them and that it's set at some, I guess, higher power. So I'm wondering, like, at each of these schools, like, who are the people that reps should go to talk to or inquire about these issues? Because there was a bit of confusion, especially early fall. We actually pulled all the we polled all the different reps and asked them about how tuition was being treated at their schools, and we were getting different answers from basically all of them.
I can take a second to talk about the tuition setting process, which might help. Every year, the corporation, the governing body of Harvard, votes on the changes to tuition and target enrollment for each program at the university. And those numbers are decided on at the local level. And so they would be put forward by ultimately the dean of a school would be approving the final thing. And at each school, there'd be a different set of advisors to the dean. So I imagine that, the dean of the students would be helping. Finance has a part. It's financial aid is involved with it. And so each place there'd be many people advising, and it'd be the leadership of the school, but ultimately it gets voted on by the governing body of Harvard.
And this may be a point where Harvard's complexity plays in, because there may be many different programs within one school. But if they're all master's programs, they may have different ways of setting the tuition for each program, even within a single school. So the answer to how does one program's tuition get set may be different from how another program's tuition gets set, and may involve somewhat different people. Though, as Julia said, ultimately it is all going to run through the dean.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I know some of the reps are definitely wondering.
So as we move on to net tuition, so I think that's a really good place to start. As Julia had mentioned, there is what we call the TIFA process that schools engage in the fall and submit in the winter time for the corporation to vote on. So then tuition packages can be published for the incoming class that will start in the fall. And so what we're looking at here is the net tuition the net tuition revenue across universities. So we're adding up the net tuition of every single school to get to these numbers. And so you'll see here we have a 10-year period. We have 5 years of actuals and then projected out 5 years of where the schools anticipate their revenue landing for net tuition. And when we say net tuition, what does that mean, or what programs are included? And so we want to be very specific. Some examples include Harvard College tuition, so for the undergraduate degree, or the MBA, MD, JD, MS. So that is what we're talking about for net tuition. There's also, as David had mentioned earlier, we have exec ed, and so that's other programs that we'll talk to in a few slides, but just want to be very hyper clear. These are our degree granting programs with the exception of DCE. That's kind of what makes up these numbers. And you'll see from kind of the trajectory from FY15 to FY20, net tuition was growing year over year around almost 4%, not quite there, but then it's anticipated to grow around 2% from FY20 to FY25. And these are early projections. These numbers will change for the future, but that's kind of where schools are seeing us. And so understanding that a part of this will be financial aid. So I would say over the last more recent history, there has been an increase in financial aid across our schools to help support our students, because it's so expensive to attend school. And so that's also an industry that's also seen across the higher ed industry. So breaking down net tuition, what does that mean and how does it work? Again, this is a pretty complicated topic, so we'll try to break it down to make it easy and digestible to understand. So first you start with gross tuition and fees. So this is the sticker price, what you see online, or the sticker price for the tuition for your school, multiplied by the number of students that are enrolled for that year. So you can see we have our different schools at the bottom. You can see their gross tuition number is the top of those lines in the dark blue, and they're all very different. So depending on the size of the school, the number of students they have, the gross tuition dollars vary by school. And then we subtract out the tuition discount. And what we mean by tuition discount is financial aid, and it's defined very specifically. So we'll try to break it down and make sure it's easy to understand how we're defining financial aid. But what we mean here by tuition discount, I think a good example is you'll receive a bill. And if you're paying full tuition, let's say in this example, full tuition is $50,000. Your bill will say you owe $50,000. If you are receiving financial aid and your financial aid package is $10,000, the financial aid you receive is $10,000, the bill you receive says you owe $40,000. So that $10,000 is that tuition discount. And so since we're just talking revenue, wanted to be pretty specific there of what tuition discount means, but I try to think of it as the bill a student receives, that is the tuition, the net tuition that we're getting to. So if you subtract out tuition discount from the gross tuition and fees, that's what gets you the net tuition. So again, across the board at the top, this is the gross tuition and fees amount right here. And then you can see how that changes by school and what the revenue they bring in from net tuition from their degree granting programs is, and again, it varies by school, depending on the tuition discount that is provided to their students. So one thing, or a couple things to call out, across the higher ed industry, net tuition does not cover the cost of education. And we'll go into that in just a minute. But one thing I want to also kind of differentiate for you is we're talking about kind of we're still talking about revenue. We haven't touched upon expenses yet. And there's also stipends. And so I think sometimes it's confusing as what's net tuition, what's a stipend. And a stipend we find is we consider an expense. So it's a type of expense because the university is like paying money for you, giving you so much money to fund travel or fund some research that you're trying to do or something along those lines. So that's how we differentiate between net tuition discount and then stipends and some scholarships. So we do have it kind of as a revenue and an expense, but just the way they're defined can be a little bit different. So before we have any questions on this, I do want to go to the next slide. So I think this is a good segue. Across higher education, net tuition does not cover the cost of education. And what we have here is an illustration. So this is based on Williams College. It's an undergraduate model based on a Williams College study. But I think visually it's helpful to, at least it helps me understand, okay, the cost of education versus the sticker price versus the average net tuition per student. So if we start on the left of the slide, at Williams College, they have determined they spend around $120,000 per student for anything from technology, lab and science equipment, student support, just helping pay salaries of anyone who works at the university or the college there to support their students, as well as different offerings. So the cost is $120,000. The undergraduate sticker price is $72,000. So there is a gap of almost $48,000 that's funded by philanthropy. So that could be current use gifts or endowment or sponsored funding that helps kind of fund that gap between the cost to the sticker price. And then if you look further down or all the way to the right, we have average net tuition per student. And so when you bring in financial aid, which is also similar to philanthropy, current use gifts, endowment, or sponsored funding that we receive, there's also another gap of around $30,000 that the school funds to help support the students. So we just wanted to kind of, tuition is a complicated topic and net tuition is complicated, and it's kind of breaking down cost to tuition to average net tuition per student. So before we move on to the next topic, any questions? Again, we went super fast through this information, so we're happy to take any questions you might have related to net tuition, our first bucket of revenue that we're covering. All right, David, I will let you take it away.
With that, we'll go into our next category of revenue, and we're going to stick in the education grouping with non-traditional education. So as Kath pointed out, we've got these examples of the traditional education, the degree granting programs. Now we're going to start talking about the other piece. And if you bring in the other part of the graph, Kath, here's some examples of non-traditional education. This covers DCE, the extension school, business schools, executive education programs, and other kinds of things like that around the university. And this dotted line up above shows the revenue of those kinds of programs. You can see that up through FY19, they were going pretty quickly. And in fact, that's been going on for a while. We all really thought that FY20 was going to be the year that executive and continuing education revenue finally outpaced traditional education revenue. But then COVID happened. Maybe we should put a little COVID symbol right there in the middle. And it really reduced that. So now it's back down again. But over the long term, we still expect that in the end, revenue from these kinds of programs is going to outpace revenue from traditional programs. And in a sense, that can be a good thing because some of these programs are targeted to working professionals and the fee to attend is paid for by a company perhaps. And so if we can use these programs to help us provide more aid and support for the traditional programs where financial aid is a big factor, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's an example of positive revenue diversification. But this slide makes it all look very, cut and dry. But as Cass mentioned, these last 5 data points, these are all speculative. We don't actually know what's going to happen. And especially in the area of non-traditional education, there could be any number of things. It's an area that's much more prone to change than traditional education has been, at least in recent years. So we could see things go in any number of directions, especially coming out of the pandemic when executive education was so heavily impacted by our on-campus operations limitations. I see a question in the chat, distinction between traditional and non-traditional. That's pretty close to it. There is one except, sorry, I guess not everyone will may be able to see it, is the distinction between traditional and non-traditional programs, formal degrees versus non-degrees. And that's pretty close. The exception, I think, is that degree programs at the Division of Continuing Education fall into the non-traditional bucket. Other than that, I think it lines up nicely to say that degree granting is traditional and non-degree granting is not, executive and continuing. So that's a really light touch on exec ed, and we'll take more questions on it if anybody has any. But we also want to touch really lightly on sponsored research because it is a big piece of the overall operation. It's a deep topic, and we've included some extra slides in the appendix of this that you can review if you want to. But to give a really quick look at it, we get sponsored research revenue from a lot of different sources. The biggest one by far is the federal government. And then we have a variety of other kinds of sources that make up the remainder. So about 72% from the federal, which leaves 28% from everything else. And for just a few examples of what these are really, on the federal side, you can see some of our major funders here. The National Institutes of Health are in there, Department of Defense is in there, Education, the National Science Foundation, NASA, some of the places that most people have probably heard of are in there. And those fund a lot of research in a lot of different fields across all of Harvard schools. That's I think I feel safe saying that's an important funding source for every school at Harvard, the federal government. In the non-federal side, there are even more different things, and there's literally only room to highlight a few of them here, but they cover a lot of territory. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does a lot of work in a lot of areas and provides funding for a lot of fields. Others are more specialized, like the Cancer Research Foundation. We've got the Mellon on there. AbbVie is one we've just recently added because AbbVie is a non-federal sponsor that specifically started funding COVID-related research since the pandemic began about a year ago. So we've added them to this slide because that's a case where non-federal funders really reacted to what was going on in the world to provide funding for relevant research. So that's a pretty awesome thing to be going on in the world and at Harvard in particular. Any questions on non-traditional education or sponsored before we dive into the endowment? Because I have to do a lot of talking on that point. Okay, let's do it. So we're going to go, we have several slides about the endowment and we'll have time for questions at the end. So we want to start at the very highest level. And so what we're looking at here is a comparison of the endowment's market value on the left. That's the headline number that you see all over the place, $40.9 billion at the end of FY19. And then on the right, we're looking at the FY20 annual budget. So just for timeline setting, it's like 2 years ago endowment value, 1 year ago budget, okay? So at the bottom is kind of the rule that starts this whole process. To sustain the endowment's purchasing power for future generations, because remember the endowment is intended to be a permanent resource, Harvard targets a payout rate of about 5% of the market value, which assumes an 8% long-term market return. The difference between those two, the 5 and the 8, is inflation. You know, there's about a 3% inflation over time on all kinds of things, including the endowment's value. And so what we do is we take this $40.9 billion and we carve out 5%. And then we figure out what that is. In this case, I think it's $2.0 billion. And that goes to form some of the revenue that supports our annual budget in the following year. That's why we laid it out this way. So this is the same 37% that we were looking at earlier on about how much of the university total revenue comes from the endowment. And it's worth pausing here to emphasize the point that the reason we do it this way, the 5% coming out, the 8% return, is to make sure that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the endowment is still in good shape and we can keep taking out 5% every year to support all the needs of the students and researchers of those days as well. If we take out too much now, then it's not going to be there for the future. And sort of looking at it the other way in time, the reason we are able to take out this much now is because people in the past were good stewards and didn't take out too much when they were sort of running things. So that's the basic calculation, and Julia can give far more detail because she knows a lot more about it than I do if there are questions, but this is the basic idea of how that comes out. And as Julia said, the endowments themselves are, the endowment funds themselves are effectively owned by different parts of Harvard. So this calculation gets done for every fund individually, and the amount that comes in for a particular school is the sum of this calculation for every fund. And I know that's a vast oversimplification, Julia. You're glaring at me in your head, but we'll let that be for the moment.
I was going to say, jumping in, I think to answer Rachel's question, I'm sorry, David, to like jump in over you. For me, visually, what's very helpful is when I look at this big light blue box of $40.9 billion, I have to like compartmentalize my mind thinking, okay, HMS can only make up a certain part of this and FAS makes up a certain box of this. So it's the 13,000 funds within each school. And so if I'm HMS, I can only touch the HMS funds of this $40.9 billion. I don't have access to everything else. And so visually for me, that's how I think about it. It's just a bunch of different boxes on top of each other in different sizes that make up this $40.9 billion. So that's visually for me, that's very helpful. So I hope others find that useful.
I see a question from Mark. Do we vary the percent of the endowment taken out in years with high or low returns? The short answer is yes. The fundamental formula is the 8% return, the 5% distribution, and the 3% inflation in there. But we don't get the same return every year. The market's different each year. There's a little bit of a lag. We don't know the return for a given year until August when all the accounting is done. But by that time, the year's already started and there's a budget. So we're always planning a little bit ahead. But given that lag, there's a formula in place that our office uses to try to make sure everything stays smooth, and that we attempt to keep to that around 5% to keep the endowment in good shape and growing along with inflation. But the formula also takes into account operational stability. You don't want there to be a really serious dip in available funds just because the endowment had a bad year. And if there's a really good year, you don't want to go crazy spending money. And the reason for that is not just, to be conservative. It's that if you spend lots of money in higher education, you may have incremental costs that carry over for the next year. It's not like you're just going to go buy extra pencils. We don't want people to hire people they won't be able to support in future years. So there are a lot of reasons to try to keep things smooth and stable. So within this general concept of giving out 5%, there are ups and downs. And our office works with the Harvard Management Company, which does the actual investing, to try to keep on top of what things will look like this year, next year, a few years. So I'm the analyst for the endowment, and I do modeling for this year, next year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years to answer different kinds of questions that we might have. The other question just popped up. Can each school vary their percent? No. The schools actually don't have any control over how much money they get. And that's really just because it's about the stewardship of the endowment and the funds. So we make things available. There are a couple ways around it. They can take money that they've had and they can put it in reserves. If they don't want to spend it that year, they can save it up, just like you'd save it up in your personal savings account to do something with it in the future. If they need to, they can do something called recapping, which is recapitalizing, putting it back in the endowment to continue making a higher return. And there's something called a decapitalization, which means you take extra money out of a specific fund that year above and beyond whatever the distribution that was set centrally is. And there are different rules around doing that. You know, you have to be a good steward of the fund and the fund terms. You have to have you know, good justifications for doing these, but they're all tools at the disposal of the schools to tweak what they're getting out of the endowment. I think a couple more questions came in. Can one school's portion of the endowment depreciate with bad investments while another school's portion gets larger? And how would that affect schools' finances? No, the whole thing is invested kind of like a mutual fund, if that means anything to some of you. And each individual fund in the endowment owns units. You can think of those as shares. And so the entire endowment is invested in many ways. Some of it's in, you know, the regular markets that you might see on the news. Some of it is in land. Some of it's all over. It's a complicated portfolio. And when it's evaluated, there's a price that's put on a unit of the endowment. And each fund owns a certain number of units at a certain price. It's like you're buying stocks. And so every single fund, every school benefits the same way based on the returns. I hope that was helpful. Did I answered a couple of questions right in a row? Did I get what everyone had in mind?
I think you got everything queued up. Maybe we'll go to the next one. We'll generate a few more. The other key concept from the very beginning about the endowment that we want to say a little more about is restriction. And as I said before, restriction means that the money is given by a donor. In this case, restriction means that money given by a donor is given for a particular purpose, and the income generated by that money can only be used for that purpose. So on the left, you see a sort of overall view. 70% of the money given to Harvard that was put into the endowment was given on a restricted basis, which means that 70% of the income that it generates every year can only be used for certain things. That leaves only 30% that's flexible, that, you know, usually a dean or the president can decide what to do with on an as-needed sort of basis. On the right, we split up the 70% to show you what it's restricted for. So the two biggest pieces, professorships might be slightly bigger, but the two biggest by far are professorships and then scholarships and students. The vast majority of our funds are given for those purposes and can only be used for those purposes. There's other things in here. You can see faculty and teaching, program support, research and arts. There's, of course, inevitably an other category. But the point really is that we're bound by these rules. You know, we made an agreement with the donor when they donated the money that we would only use it for these purposes. And we have to do a lot of work to show that we're sticking to those agreements. There are legal consequences if we don't. So it leaves that 30% on the left, the unrestricted piece, as what's available to be deployed for new important strategic initiatives. You know, if you want to start a new program and no one's donated any money for it yet, you're going to have to find other sources of revenue, and that's the only piece of the endowment available for that sort of thing. So that's a really key concept, because you can imagine that some of those schools that had really big endowment dependence on that revenue graph, a lot of their endowment itself is restricted in what they can do with it. Some of these restrictions go down to particular departments. Some of them go down to particular projects, even like not even a field, but a subfield. I spent some time at the School of Public Health, and there might be an endowment that was restricted to the study of a particular disease. You know, it's that narrow. So they come in all shapes and sizes, but we spend a lot of time making sure that we stick to them. And this is really one of the biggest things to know about the endowment, is how much of it can only be spent for certain things. We can't. We truly are not allowed to spend it on just anything that we would want to. Any questions here? These are dense slides, so we'll pause a little more often. Okay, we'll do one more endowment slide. So this is looking at the market value of the endowment over time. And if you start back in 2005 and sort of follow the top there, you can see the line. You can see the drop from 2008 to 2009 in the Great Recession. The endowment lost, what is that, close to a quarter of its value in 1 year. And then since then, it's been coming back. And a couple of years ago, we finally crossed the threshold where we recovered the market value from the endowment. But if you look at that 2008 point and just grow by inflation going forward, it's about 3% per year. We did the actual math for this, so there's some fraction in there that's 2 point something for the real inflation for all these years. But if you do that math, if we had just grown from 2008 at the rate of inflation, the endowment would now need to be worth about $44 billion to support the same activities that it did back in 2008. That's what it really translates to, right? It's what can we do because we have this endowment? And in order to do the same amount of stuff, we would need about $44 billion in the endowment. We're still only about 42. So we haven't truly caught up on our purchasing power, even if the sort of dollar value, market value has caught up. So that's another key thing, because we've talked right about different revenue mixes and how different schools have different mixes and how it changes over time. This is an example of it changing over time. The endowment is supporting less of our operations than it used to. And so other sources have had to pick that up. So that, I think, is the last of our revenue categories. We can pause here again in case anyone has any questions about the endowment or any of the other categories we've covered, or key things you might be interested in that we didn't manage to cover. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I've just got a question about drawing down on the endowment, and I apologize because I may have missed it, but I just wanted to clarify. So one of you suggested that, you know, the amount that, you know, the sort of variability in the 5%, that allocation is centrally done and schools don't have control over, you know, 5.1, 5.2, et cetera, of the portion of the endowment that they can draw down. What are the considerations that go into whether it's 5.1, 5.2, 4.9% per year? And who makes that decision?
It's a great question. It's a combination of people who make the decision, first of all. Our office, OFSP, is one of those stakeholders. And ultimately, it's the corporation of Harvard, again, that votes on it. It's one of the few voting moments that we have in the year, along with setting tuition rates. And we put together a recommendation with Tom Hollister, the CFO, and Larry Bacow, the president. So there's a formula that I mentioned. We call it the 70-30 formula because it's 70% weighted towards budgetary stability, making sure that schools are able to have enough consistency year to year to continue functioning, and the 30% is based on what's happening in the market. So, you know, if you have a whole series of banner years, more money goes out, and if you have a series of years where it hasn't performed as well, it'll slowly be less. So the formula has several major inputs, one of them being what we did last year to make sure that's the stability factor. But another factor is that 5% target. So we say it's a big complicated model that I'm working on all the time. To boil it down, it's always aiming for 5%. It's always trying to get us back to that. And so the variation year to year is when it takes into account these other factors, you know, whether it's been a really good year, whether last year was a bad year and we didn't have as much available for the budget. And the formula is always trying to guide us towards the 5%. And that's because that's what's sustainable. The reason it's sustainable is because we know that the endowment is going to average an 8% return. That's something that we're always looking at. We don't just take these assumptions for granted. And the 3%, which is sort of the inflation stand-in, higher education has a higher inflation rate than some other industries, but the 3% is the good stand-in for that. And so 8 minus 3 equals 5. If we want the endowment to continue growing, to do all the things like David was talking about, that it's capable of doing today and yesterday, we want to do tomorrow and in 50 years, 5% is that target. So our office runs models for next year and into the future and says, here's what we should really be doing for distribution to maintain operational stability and maintain our responsibility for future generations. And we balance all of those things out and come up with a recommendation, which a lot of stakeholders have factors in. So is that, I feel like there was a part 2 of your question that I forgot.
Could I ask a quick follow-up question? Sorry, I'm mindful of time and other people, but so one consideration that's not coming out that I just want to clarify is that it's never the case that the endowment is drawn upon because, say, there's an exceptional need. It's like something, you know, COVID, for example, has presented exceptional needs perhaps for the student. Yeah, so Julia, thanks.
I wouldn't say that that's never the case. That is the case if there's an exceptional need. It's still a balancing act. You can't draw down to the extent that everyone's going to suffer in the future because of the exceptional need. And you don't want to draw down to the extent that next year is going to be in trouble as well. But, you know, when COVID happened, there were a lot of conversations around what to do with the rate that that everybody was involved with. There was a lot of close monitoring of what was going on and making sure that, you know, the current need was being balanced against the need of the endowment for the future. Tons of conversations happened to make sure that things were being taken into account. And that's always the case. That's part of the operational stability issue. And a decap for a specific fund could be used as an extraordinary need situation as well, depending on the nature of it. That said, this is not a savings account you can just tap into because you have an emergency. It's not that easy. The distribution happens once a year, and what happens this year affects next year and the year after, and there's no way around those facts. But extraordinary need is thought about. And I think we have 2 other questions floating out here. I see.
And Julia, I'm wondering, because we have about 20 minutes of time and so a bunch of slides to get through. If it's okay, we can hear the questions, and if we can answer them quickly, we can do that, or we'll wait till the very end, because I just want to make sure we get through some of the material. So I think Abinaya.
Yeah. Sorry, just to make sure that we're timely, like you said. I noticed that on the agenda there is a 12-minute video. Is that something you want to squeeze into the 20 minutes, or? Okay,
No,
just double checking.
You're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome to watch the video on your own. That it goes into a little bit more detail about the endowment and how it works.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Abinaya.
Yeah, so 2 questions. The first being, what sort of public transparency is there around where the investments in the of the endowment are, like where the endowment is invested in, and what sort of avenues are there to learn about that sort of information? And then the second question that I have is, what sort of policies are in place around gift acceptance, with what you mentioned, like 70% of gifts being restricted to certain sort of specific goals? What are there who decides like the guidelines of what sort of gifts are accepted or not? Those are kind of 2 big questions, and I know there may not be time to answer, but just
do a quick answer for both of them. The first about transparency. You can all look at the HMC website. That's the Harvard Management Company, and they have some information about where they invest and what their goals are. And so anything that they've got, they publish some reports. It's interesting reading. Our office doesn't do the actual investing. And the other about guidelines for restrictions. First, our development teams are very aware of some of the problems that have been happening with donors in the news, and they try to do a good job understanding who we're accepting money from. And the other aspect of that, they know it can be difficult to spend highly restricted funds. And so we have recommended language that they try to put into fund terms to make them a little bit looser, a little more flexible, forward-looking. Some donors still have very specific ideas, but development is highly aware of the dangers of over-restriction. And so they work on that as well. We have a couple more questions coming in. I'm not sure what does Harvard ever invest in the endowment directly means. We do recap funds. If a school or unit wants to put money back in, I guess you could think of that as direct investment. And then was the inflation's 3% tapped into for 2020 as it acted like a recession time period during COVID? It doesn't quite work that way. But let's see, how can I get to this? We don't have it broken out into that inflation. The formula has this inflation concept baked into it. And the way we thought about it was we looked at the future of what distributions would be going forward if we made various changes. But actually before COVID came, the formula had already been run for a variety of scenarios. And so we had a lot that we could look at. And luckily it ended up not being as bad of a year as we might have anticipated. The endowment did just fine. So that wasn't a problem.
I think from there, we might want to step right on into expenses, so we make sure to cover some of these interesting topics at the end.
Yeah, so I think with that, we'll move pretty quickly through the next few topics, and we'll have all questions at the end, just to make sure we touch upon everything to give kind of the last part of the presentation. So we'll quickly touch upon FY20 expenses. Last year, we spent $5.4 billion. Half of those expenses were on people, or just over half was people, and then about 20% is space. So the blue is people, the gray is just expenses for space. So that's about 70% of our expense base is fixed cost. And so that can be difficult in terms of cost containment. We'll talk about that in a second, but we also spent about 5% of our total expenses on supplies and equipment and services purchase that we bring in, as well as a variety of other expenses, as David has kind of alluded to throughout the presentation. It's made up of many different categories. But going to those fixed costs, here on the right, in terms of people, we try to have competitive salaries as it employs over 20,000 people, as well as benefits to bring in some of the best faculty to teach our students and do incredible research. We also have been adding different personnel related to different student needs or related to compliance, whether that has been with a new tax law that has been put into place, and just how we have to work through some federal sponsored or sponsored research. We need to bring more people in to support some of the needs of kind of managing some of those different sponsored funds. And on the space side, so we've said we have 650 buildings and over 5,000 acres around the world. And most of that's in Boston and Cambridge. And Boston and Cambridge is really expensive, as we all know. And so maintaining and keeping those costs limited without expense growth year over year can be difficult. So again, 70% of our expenses are pretty fixed, and we continue to increase it a little bit year over year to continue to pay people, as well as the increasing cost of space. And then as we look to COVID again, and thinking about how we manage expenses, I think there's a couple of things to point out. So last April, university leadership, they published these three principles that have guided our financial decisions. So prioritizing the health and safety of the community, maintaining excellence in the educational and research mission, and recognizing that Harvard is its people. And so these three principles have been outlined for all schools and units to follow in terms of making decisions of what expenses to cut and how they're thinking about or noticing we have declining revenues. How do we fund those? What do we support? So these three principles have really been touched upon day after day and month after month throughout the crisis as we've been making these decisions to cut discretionary spending, keeping those top of mind. And then following these three principles that were laid out by the president and EVP and provost, there were three financial mantras that the finance committee of the corporation came up with, and that was in crisis, we need to stay liquid. So we need to have as many reserves on hand as possible because we don't know what is going to unfold with the pandemic. So we have to be able to maneuver pretty quickly when needed. Also match spending with declining revenue. So wherever possible, cut discretionary spending, travel or unnecessary supplies, and not as much food for certain events or some things like that, or no, there's no spending for events. So match that spending with declining revenues, and then selectively invest and look for opportunities to strengthen the enterprise. So with every crisis, it's also finding where do we need to prioritize and reallocate some of our resources of what we've been doing in the past, but where it's going to lead us in the future. And then these are just a couple of quotes of how leaders have really guided the finance departments as well as the entire 20,000 employees at Harvard to make decisions to react to the COVID crisis. And then bringing back kind of this same chart that David had mentioned with the endowment, we're looking at the same time frame. And if you can remember what that graph was, in 2009, we saw a big dip in the endowment. And then the endowment is about 35% of our revenues. And so when you grow it by inflation year over year, the endowment is not where it should be. However, if you take that same time frame and you grow inflation from 2008 year over year, our expenses are outpacing inflation. And so this can cause a bit of tension in terms of revenues and expenses as we are trying to balance our budgets as we move forward. So with expenses and costs, we mentioned it a little earlier, but our two main missions of teaching and research, we talked about this back with the net tuition. Both of our missions don't break even financially on the teaching side or the research side. And these are quotes from peers that we have. So this quote is actually pretty old from 2016, but again, it's the same. Williams College did the same study. At that point in time, the cost of education was closer to $100,000. Now it's closer to $120,000. But on the research side, the cost of research is not covered by the sponsored funding from the federal government or our non-federal sponsors that give us money to do the research. So but we have to find revenues from other places to fund both teaching and research.
And that transitions us nicely into talking about operating margin. You remember from the initial definitions, this is that last one. This is the operating revenue minus the operating expense, the operating margin. And where Kath was talking about teaching and research not breaking even financially, this is the same sort of concept, but looked at everything Harvard does. And so when you look at this graph, you can again sort of see the impact of the financial crisis coming in at a slight delay because of details. And then it has been recovering up since then until in FY19, we were at a $290 million operating surplus. And then when the pandemic hit, it had a really big impact, as we've discussed in other places. That brought us back down to a negative $10 million an operating deficit. And you know, it's moved around, and it's important to acknowledge that $298 million is an awful lot of money. You know, for anybody that's a big number. So we also like to look at this in context of scale of the university. So we've talked about revenue growth over that time. So here what we're showing in the blue bars is the revenue in all these years. And then at the bottom, we have that same dotted line for the operating result. You see the $298 million in FY19. And we do this to really point out that these are fairly small percentages of the university's revenue as a whole. And if we put in the percentages at the bottom, you'll see that they are largely pretty close to zero. You know, the highest one we have here is 6. There's a -1 in there. This is all fairly close to zero. And going back to for-profit businesses, you might look at a net margin percentage or something like that. And these would still be fairly low numbers. In particular, we can compare ourselves to things like nonprofit hospitals who target having an 8 to 10% operating surplus every year. So even though $298 million is a lot of money, it's a fairly small percentage of Harvard's revenue. And the reason that's important is that we use these surpluses as we can build them up to do other things. Remember, we talked about capital, buildings, doing things like that, starting new initiatives, new programs that didn't exist before. That money that we generate over time is what we use to do those things. So it's important to have a little of that because some of those expenses are necessary. We need to maintain our buildings. And others are really important to us in terms of our mission, you know, starting new academic programs, supporting new important initiatives. So we provide that just to give context on those numbers. And then the other piece of context we want to give is that, like everything else we've said, ETOB is in play. The operating result varies by school. So this is all of Harvard's schools. On the far left, you've got HMS, which in FY20 had a $37 million operating surplus. And then on the far right, you've got FAS, which had a $13 million operating deficit. We can add the percentages for these two to show the scale. You can see that that $5 million for HMS is 5%, but then the $13 million for FAS was only -1%. So there's definitely a scaling thing going on here. It might be important also to note that this does not look at restricted or unrestricted. This is everything. So in cases where somebody might have had significant amount of restricted revenue, that would be reflected in these numbers. And in fact, I think I remember that HMS had a significant restricted gift that was made and publicized in FY20, and it was towards the end of the year. So they received the gift before they could really start spending it before the year ended. So a lot of that revenue just stayed in FY20 and bumped up their operating result. So because Harvard is operating on, you know, the scale of hundreds of years of history and future, you know, some of these changes in a single year can have a sort of outsized effect on the operating result for an individual school. So the last thing we'll say about operating result is that it's one piece of a larger puzzle about our finances. We've talked a couple of times about cash for capital. Capital is the other big category of our spending in addition to our day-to-day operations. And this is a really simplified view of how all of that fits together. So if you think of it this way, you take the cash, the surplus or deficit from operations that we just talked about, plus any philanthropy you received from capital. That's a gift given particularly to do a construction or renovation project. And then out of that, you take our capital expenditures, which can be significant. You know, during some big building phases when we were working on the SEC in Austin, capital expenditures were $800, $900 million a year. So we have to fund that somehow, and we do it primarily from cash through operations and philanthropy for capital. So when you subtract the capital expenditures from those sources, then you get our real cash surplus or deficit. And this gets back to the reason why we want to have some operating surpluses. You know, we build those up so that we can make these larger capital expenditures periodically and still have, you know, a positive cash surplus at the end of this sort of multi-year calculation of our finances.
So now we'll just touch briefly on the higher education industry in general, and where Harvard kind of sits across the industry and where the industry is leading into COVID and then during the COVID crisis. So on this slide, what we want to show is that our revenue has slowed down. So higher education is in a mature industry right now, and revenue is slowing down, or the pace it's increasing is slower, even though the base is pretty high. So you can see even in 2000, 2005, 2010, it's increasing pretty quickly because the base just is that large. So a 3.4% increase on a large base still is a pretty wide increase. However, it does create this tension of, as expenses are continuing to grow, we have these fixed expenses of people in space. As revenue is not growing as quickly, we have to contain expenses. And we've seen revenue growth slow down from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and then 2010. And then here, what we put together is just a little dashboard of how OFSP has kind of thought about these different industry issues and how it impacts the overall industry, as well as the impact of Harvard. Just to kind of compare and contrast a few of these, we've broken them down into 3 categories: pressure on traditional revenue sources, costs that are hard to control, and then state of the industry. And you can see here, I think a couple of them, or I'll call out. So Harvard does not receive state funding, whereas many universities do receive state funding, and that has been declining more recently. So for us, it's not as big of a pressure. And then the endowment, many schools don't have an endowment, and that is a very big piece of our revenue, as we discussed. And so again, each school across the industry is very different, but we're all feeling some of these pressures through the mature state of the industry is in. The last one I'll call out is dependence on in-person facilities. So with the COVID crisis, school has been in person, but what does the future of higher education look like? We're not quite sure, and we'll continue to see that unfold as time goes on. This slide goes to one of our questions. I forget who asked the question earlier, but it's just showing how our revenue has changed, or our revenue portfolio has changed over the last 2 decades. And you can see that we're much more dependent on philanthropy than we were in 1998. And then we are, our net tuition has decreased over the past 2 decades, really because there has been more of an initiative for financial aid to help support students in that way. So that's where that -6 is coming from. And then also we are not as dependent on federal sponsored for revenue. That has shifted. Again, we've diversified a little bit more into non-federal, as well as tapped into more philanthropy resources.
So we've got just a few slides left, and they go very quickly. So you can read these quotations for yourselves, but what we want to say here is that even before COVID, the industry was already starting to face some pressures. As Cass said, it's a mature industry now, and there were already some growing pressures around affordability and other challenges. And you can read more about these from these various sources. And this is all pre-COVID. This was already in place. On the next slide, we have a few more quotes that are post-COVID. These are all since the crisis began. And what they get to is that many of Harvard higher education's revenue sources have been particularly challenged over the last year. Harvard's executive education profile is mentioned in the upper left, but there are others that we don't have that other institutions are incredibly affected by, like athletic revenue or hospital revenue for a while was a big concern and a problem for some institutions. And then just across everybody in the lower right, we're seeing enrollment go down over time at the undergraduate level. So these are all things that have added to the problems that were already in place to create a challenging environment for higher ed going forward. And that's one of the reasons that coming out of the pandemic, we don't know exactly what the future of higher education will look like in the short term. And then the last thing we'll close with, because we like to end on a somewhat higher note than that, is this quote from President Bacow from the most recent annual financial report, which I'm sure you all did read before tonight, but you didn't have to, it's fine. And it just says, how we manage declining revenue and rising need for investment in excellence amid new and necessary health protocols will in part determine our successors' ability to endure and thrive. Fortunately, the people of Harvard and alumni and friends around the world have come together to see the institution through uncertainty for generations. there's a lot in this, but what I think it says to me is that Harvard has been through these kinds of problems before. And by, looking out for our current students, looking out for our current faculty and research, but also looking out for our future students, our future faculty and research, we've managed to stay on a good course and keep Harvard strong and successful through all these years. So final slide, we just want to go back to the key points that we pointed out way back in the beginning and just put them up here again to make sure that we understand them all. So our mission is to excel in teaching and research, and that's how we allocate our resources. We're large, complex, and decentralized. I think if there's nothing else you get out of this, large, complex, and decentralized becomes pretty clear. On the financial side, teaching and research generate less than half of our revenue, so we have to find other sources through diversification. The endowment is a unique asset. It means it's meant to last forever, and it's restricted. Those are the two main points. Cost containment is challenging in higher ed because we have a lot of fixed costs, primarily in the form of people and space. And then finally, the industry is facing a lot of challenges these days. Harvard is insulated from some of them, but definitely not from all. 9:02. If we have minutes, we can use a couple for questions.
We did receive a couple of questions just to touch upon briefly in the survey that was sent out. So I'm just pulling those up. We talked about, so some of it was just, or one of the questions we received was, how has the pandemic affected Harvard's revenue and costs, and what trade-offs have you had to make? We talked a little bit about COVID and the impacts of revenue and expenses. Another question or topic was just COVID relief for students, and these decisions are made at the local level. So within each school there have been decisions of how to help relieve students, and I would say talk to local administrators in that way of providing certain support, but those have all been local decisions. And then another one has been reallocation of Harvard's resources for projects related to racial justice following last summer. And I would say this is a strategic priority we're seeing across all of our schools and units, and they are really trying to understand how can we reallocate resources to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And there is a central office that has been set up the last several years, DIB. So there's the support of a central office to all of the local DIB offices at the schools, and they are working on allocating resources to DIB efforts. I don't know if David and Julia also have anything to add for either one of those.
Angela, did you have a question?
Hello, my name is Angela from HGC. Thank you so much first for being here today. So in 2020, President Bacow described climate change as a defining issue of our time. So the university is also setting a goal to have the endowment reflect net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050. So I was just wondering, what are the current efforts and commitment to eliminate carbon footprint extend to investment portfolio, and how does this work between Harvard Management Company and the Harvard Corporation for the general public to ensure portfolios transparency and emission levels?
A good question. First, a little bit more about how the endowment works. There are a lot of longer term investments built in as well. You know, if we decided, if the Harvard Management Company decided tonight that we only wanted to invest in cheese, I don't know, that's the first thing that came to mind. It would probably take years for that to actually happen, just due to the complicated nature of the investment. Remember, this is an entity that's meant to last forever, and so it has lots of complicated moving pieces. So that's part of why it's not a goal that can happen immediately. The other part is that while the corporation is involved with hearing what's going on at HMC and we all work together. None of us are the investors, and the Harvard Management Company does the investment. There's a lot of communication. I do encourage everybody, if you haven't, if you're interested in this, to go to the Harvard Management Company website. They do have a lot of information there. They do publish reports. It's very interesting. There's actually information about endowments and their investments from many universities if you do a little bit of Googling, and that's interesting. So I hope that was a helpful answer.
All right, so I just want to say thank you so much for the Finance 101 presentation by all of the Harvard staff and administrators. Unfortunately, we are at time, and we are at 9:07 now. So we are going to move on to other items in our agenda. But if you have any questions and you feel comfortable, being contacted via email or any other contact method, feel free to drop your email or contact information in the chat, and I'm sure our reps will reach out to you outside of general counsel hours. But with that, we're going to pass the mic over to our HMS reps, Hugh and Teresa, to do our HMS campus tour.
Great, thank you, Peter. I'm just gonna, oh wait, how do I share the screen? It says it's disabled right now.
Yeah, I will make you co-hosts right now.
Okay.
You should be all set.
Okay. Can you see that all right? Yeah, okay.
Looks good.
So welcome everyone to HMS. We're so glad to have you here today. My name is Hugh. I'm a first-year medical student, and I'll let Tarika introduce herself too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tarika. I'm the alternate rep for HMS. And yeah, thank you so much for visiting our school today.
So this picture here is the iconic quadrangle in the Longwood Medical Area. As we mentioned, we're both first-year medical students, so we have actually never really done much here. Hopefully that'll change in the coming weeks, but that is to be determined. There we go.
So the core commitments of HMS were sort of situated on 3 pillars, with the first being scientific discovery and integrity, the second being diversity and professional development, and the third being service to humanity, which I think really just sort of encapsulates the sort of legacy and like iconic vision of Harvard, is just sort of like advancing medicine and bringing us forward in service of our patients. So I think those kind of speak for themselves. I'm not gonna hit y'all over the head too much on those.
Yeah, so these are just some stats about the MD program. There are 2 main, I'd say pathways, but one is called pathways, so that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but there are 2 main curriculums that the MD students follow, either pathways, which is the majority of students, 135 per year, and then health sciences and technology, which is a collaboration between HMS and MIT, and that accepts around 30 students per year. And in addition, there are MD, PhD programs. And students in those fit into either pathways in HST. And students can complete their PhDs in basic and translational sciences or in social sciences.
So it's important to know that even though it's called Harvard Medical School, our school is not just comprised of medical students. We also have a very large population of master's and PhD students who are learning different aspects of medicine, especially as it applies to academia. So we have 8 different programs across the academic discipline and medical science tracks. There are the Master of Bioethics, Master in Clinical Service Operations, Master of Biomedical Informatics, of Healthcare Quality and Safety, clinical investigation, global health delivery, medical education, immunology. I think that's all 8. So we had 196 matriculating students in 2020. And since many of these programs are 2-year programs, that's 309 total. And we have 893 current PhD students. And I'll also mention sort of the diversity of our master's community. Several of these individuals are not just students who are straight out of undergrad. In fact, the vast majority, I would say, in several of the degree programs are healthcare professionals here in the US. Many are clinicians, as well as many different clinicians across the world. In particular, like the Global Health Delivery Program, for example, is mostly made of physicians and professional nurses from low and middle income countries. So we're certainly expanding the impact that Harvard has worldwide.
And one of those master's students is our very own Peter Choi as well. So a brief history of Harvard Medical School. It's the third oldest medical school in the United States. I believe after UPenn and Columbia, established in 1782, originally in Cambridge, and then it moved around to a bunch of different places in Boston. So these are just some old-timey photo/drawings of those buildings before it finally landed at its current location, which you saw in the first slide in the Longwood Medical Area in 1906. Didn't accept its first class of female students until 1945, and even more recently than that, started accepting Black students and other students in minority demographics. And there's still a lot of work to be done at HMS in that space.
So a little bit about student life here at HMS. So I'll say one unique thing about the way Harvard Medical School is structured is we're actually integrated with the dental school for the first year of our curriculum, at least for the Pathways curriculum. So a lot of the student life is built around joint medical and dental ventures. And then after that, we kind of split into our respective schools. So here pictured, we have Vanderbilt Hall, which is our beloved dorm. Typically out of the first year class, we have almost like 80% or so residing in this dorm, and it's literally across the street from TMEC, which is where we do most of our academic learning. However, COVID has obviously changed that. Even though Vandy is open, a lot of the students this year have chosen not to live in Vanderbilt just because it's mostly closed down and has really strict restrictions right now. Our student council, which both you and I serve on, is mostly made up of first year students, which is a little bit interesting considering that, you know, the MD program is at least 4 years. This is mostly kind of a tradition that we have based on an understanding that the person who serves as the president for the class will sort of retain that title for the entire 4 years. And first year students are really the only ones who have the bandwidth to sort of do the logistics of organizing events, of surveying, of talking to faculty regularly. So we communicate regularly with our upperclassmen to make sure we channel their interests and wishes into our policies, but for the most part, we sort of take on the day-to-day legwork of administration. We have 99 active student groups, and that's ever growing. Of course, one dedicated to many of the different specialties that are in medicine, but we also have a burgeoning amount of advocacy and social issue-based groups, a lot of culture and heritage groups such as SNMA for Black students, Latino Medical Students Association, there's South Asian and Pacific Islander, LAMS, which is the LGBTQ and allies, and they all, you know, sort of work together to make incredible events and reach out to the community as well. And finally, we are divided into 5 different societies in how we approach our learning. So HST has their own society, that's the London Society, and they kind of all learn together in a cohort joined by Harvard and MIT. And then the pathway students are split into 4, Hinton, Castle, Kinnan, and Peabody. So you have about 40 students or so who are learning all theoretically in the same room and really creating those close bonds as we're learning in person together.
So while those societies are called like academic societies, they really do serve a social function for students. So this is something that you need a degree to really understand in the first place. It's the Pathways curriculum map. So this is basically what a medical degree looks like for the majority of students at HMS, just as an example to you all, and we're not going to take the time to walk through it.
And here we have our many different clinical partners that we work with. I'd say the 4 primary hospitals where most students are sort of divided in their time are MGH, BWH, and Beth Israel, and that's where most students will do their clerkships. You can also opt in to do your clerkships at Cambridge Health Alliance, which has a very unique longitudinal clerkship model where you are kind of given a panel of patients and you follow them through all the different services that they have, rather than being on medicine and then on surgery and not really having that longitudinal relationship. For students who are at Beth Israel and BWH, they do their pediatrics rotation at Boston Children's. So we also have a pretty tight affiliation with them as well. But students have been known to do both clinical rotations and research at all of these different hospitals and clinical centers. So we really do have a growing network across the Boston area.
So I couldn't possibly hope to capture everything that's happening at HMS in a single slide. So this is sort of, I guess, an executive summary of some of the things that are happening in the Student Council and in the administration at HMS currently. So there's a lot of work and conversations going into ensuring that our medical education takes into account different kinds of bodies and different colors of skin to truly capture the patient populations that we'll all be serving in the future, as historically images and diagrams have typically focused on the white male form, which doesn't capture the spectrum of presentations of illness. And we would be doing ourselves a disservice in diagnosing different conditions if that's all that we ever looked at. We're working on incorporating more anti-racism education across the curriculum. There's always more that can be done there, but making sure that it's included in conversations regularly is important for the students and for the faculty. And one of the examples of this not happening necessarily in the curriculum, but one of the societies was recently renamed Hinton from Holmes in honor of one of the first Black physicians from HMS to replace the legacy of another physician who was responsible for, I believe he was the dean of HMS at one point and was responsible for expelling some of the first Black students at HMS. So that was Holmes, now the Hinton Society. Another thing that's happening at HMS is increasing awareness that we as a medical community need to do better to engage with the people of Boston that we live with and serve. And to that end, the Office of Community-Centered Medical Education is being established to kind of figure out how to best create that relationship. And then, as a lot of other schools are doing, a COVID-19 financial impact survey to get a better understanding of what the pandemic has meant for the students financially, but I think it's also important to think about what it's done for our education as well. And then lastly, ongoing conversations about returning to in-person classwork, given that HMS students are fortunate to have been vaccinated for the large part, and we're just itching to get back in the classroom together. So those are some things that are happening right now at our school. And I think that's all that we have for you today. Unless Tarika, did you want to close out?
I'll just say a couple things. The first is that one thing that we're trying to kind of be aware of is that we realize we have a huge amount of master's and PhD students who are in Harvard Medical School, but don't really have the same amount of representation as the medical students do, especially when it comes to even HGC. So we are actively thinking about ways to amend that and make sure that our master's students really do feel incorporated, because it is such a diverse group of people that we can learn from. I mean, truly perspectives of many professional clinicians who are across the world. So we're definitely really thinking about that and trying to address that more so in the greater Harvard community. And the second, I'll just talk in response to Brett's question, whether medical school is as difficult as I thought it would be. I think certainly no medical student enters school thinking that it's going to be easy. And I think I was mentally prepared for the amount of rigor, but COVID has certainly thrown us for a loop in having to do most of our learning virtually. unlike most medical schools in the country, Harvard is one of the few that requires in-person attendance, at least for the Pathways program, and I think the same for MIT. So it's really a curriculum that's based on interpersonal communication and problem-based learning. So having to do that on Zoom was definitely challenging. I know I'm channeling a lot of the students' feeling of angst in regards to that. But I think as we're moving on to clerkships and as we're transitioning back to being in person, it's getting a lot better. So I'll say that the academic work is as rigorous as I thought it would be. It's just been harder to sort of socially grow as a class, but we're getting there.
All right, Hugh and Trika, thank you so much for the HMS virtual campus tour. I am gonna sort of ask us to move things along, unfortunately, just to be sensitive of time. But up next would be our public comments, and it'd be Mina and Heidi with the memo on lifetime Harvard emails.
Hi guys. So everyone got this memo in the agenda, and I know Peter also sent it out. Thank you, Peter. I believe you guys have gotten a chance to look at this. And I also think Heidi and I will be talking about it in a minute to elaborate on it further, but I wanted to ask you guys to send this memo to your own Dean of Students at your school, as well as your individual school's alumni liaison, and even your help desk IT representative that every school has their own. So they will meet probably in the next couple of weeks to discuss this. And so it would be really helpful if you guys start advocating on the ground level, just to make sure that this is heard at all levels. The memo is, as you can see, already going to be sent to the Alumni Council or the Harvard Alumni Association and all of the provost office and everything, but we need your support at your school level. Thanks.
All right, sounds good. And we will revisit it in the action items, which is now. So Mina, would you like to make the motion?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a second?
A second.
Could you give me your name and school, please?
Naomi Oliver from Extension.
Sorry, your face doesn't always pop up when you talk, so it's hard to know where it's coming from. Okay, and with that, we are now open for discussion. Are there any discussion points on this motion?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that I think Abhinaya was going to speak to this later on, and it might be moot if it's after the vote. So maybe she can speak to it now.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Mina. So essentially this memo came out, Mina had brought this issue up to the council earlier this year, essentially pointing out that in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the email issue, the lack of universal lifetime emails is a real issue with students being unable to stay connected to the Harvard network, access job opportunities. So last year, they provided, the Harvard University provided a one-year extension on emails for 2020 grads. Right now, there isn't any clear commitment for a similar thing for 2021 grads. So this memo basically outlines why lifetime email access is important. It's an issue of equity, especially for students from underrepresented backgrounds, low-income backgrounds. The Harvard network is so critical, and losing access to it when you graduate, especially graduating in the midst of a pandemic, is an issue. We've heard that the existing email is just an alias email, so you can't actually send emails from it, which is a real challenge because that is really the power of the email, is being able to send something with the Harvard name. And just more broadly, it's just a way to stay connected to your professors, to all of the networks that you've built. And when you don't have that Harvard email, it's very difficult to do that. So this memo just outlines it and lays out two main requests. At first, that at minimum, that the Harvard University schools work together to maintain at least a 2-year extension of emails for graduates for this year so that they can still have that networking opportunity for jobs. And the second request is to actually institute lifetime emails following the lead of many of our peer institutions, Cornell, Brown, many others, Yale, that are outlined in the memo. And actually Harvard Law and Harvard Business School already do this for their students. So it'd be important for other schools to have access. Just an overview of the memo, and the two final requests, as I mentioned, are the extension and the lifetime emails.
Sounds good. And sorry again for the sake of time, Finance 101 took such a long time. So I'm only going to take 2 more points if anyone else wants to contribute to the conversation. Okay, and if there's no other discussion points, then we will move forward with voting. All those in favor of passing the memo, please type aye. All those against, please type nay. All those who'd like to abstain, please type abstain. Okay. 10 votes in, waiting on 2 more. And Saeed, you'll vote on behalf of Hugsy. 11. All right, 12 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstentions. So motion passes unanimously. All right, up next, executive update.
Great. Yeah, so I'm gonna go really quickly. This is our last meeting before spring elections in 2 weeks, April 5th. So I just sent everyone, so all the reps, please check your emails. I just sent you an email with our newsletter that we sent out with information on elections. Please forward that to all your schools' emailing channels. I also included the links for our social media. So please push it out as much as possible. Given that we're virtual, this is like the only way we can get the word out regarding elections. But yeah, I just looked at the list. Currently, we don't have that many names, and we sent out the email through our like emailing channel, which is like 2,000 people. So we might need some more help getting the word out for that. So that's what I wanted to say about spring elections. Please, if there's only been one thing you remember from things that we say in our executive updates, like please send that out. And then I just wanted to give everyone a quick update regarding the SHIP committee meeting. So I sit on the student health insurance plan committee as in my role as Harvard Graduate Council president. So we only had one meeting this year. Normally it's like you're supposed to have it pretty regularly, but I guess as a result of the pandemic, we only had one meeting, which was like last week. And we kind of discussed about all the various issues that's been met this year in students like dropping out, doing deferrals and leaves of absences. So we had maybe like around a 2,000 student drop in those enrolled in the student health program, and how that affected costs and everything. One really interesting point I wanted to bring up was regarding the mental health cap, because I know that's been mentioned at least by reps and also by visiting speakers in the past for Harvard Graduate Council, but I'm not sure if everyone knows, but there was a cap at 40 outpatient visits, and anyone who went beyond that, you just couldn't have any more of those visits. Even when you had the copay, it was like $0 copay for visits 1 through 8, and then $35 copay for visits 9 through 40. But this year, what they actually did was they increased the limit for AY21 from 40 to 52, and they actually haven't been seeing super huge increases in the number of costs. So what they have seen is there's been a greater usage of mental health services and a greater number of users, but then also the number of users reaching the 40 visit cap is about doubled. It used to be only 0.8% of all students enrolled would reach the 40 cap. This year it was 1.6% reach that cap, but the differences in costs per individual enrollee is not super significant. So there was some really great discussions about why that was the case. And some like thoughts surrounding that was that because visits are virtual now, more people are utilizing it. And there's also a demand for that in the, because we're currently in a pandemic. And there was a vote, I think at the end, well, it was a informal vote to keep the cap at 52, at least moving forward in the next year. So they're not going back to 40 just yet. So, but there is the possibility that in a few years that they might go back to 40. So I just wanted to update everyone on that. And I thought it was a very interesting meeting to attend.
Chatty, are they reinstating the copay?
Are they what, sorry?
Are they reinstating the copay?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't talk about that actually, but let me. Yeah, let me go figure that out and get back to you. I'm not sure. We only discussed whether people's reactions were to returning to the 40. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Just to chime in, I believe the copay is only suspended through the state emergency period. And after that, you have to start paying after 8 sessions.
This is for mental health. Sorry. Yeah, Mina's correct as far as I'm aware too. And then it's $35 up to 52, and then it's full after that. And I think what they're not clear about, I think, is whether they're prorating the 52 sessions. So like if the state of emergency was lifted tomorrow and someone's had 18 sessions, would the copay start then, or would that be considered 18 of 52? I'm not sure.
Yeah, those were all really good questions. Let me send a follow-up email to ask the committee. But yeah, this is the last time that they're meeting this year, so I can follow up.
Sorry, just a question. Are they extending the 52 limit? Was that discussed?
Like beyond 52, I don't think that was an option that was discussed. It was just whether they were going to maintain it at 52 moving forward. There was definitely a lot of interest regarding why there was more utilization by more members of the community. Like in the past, it was, I think they were like limiting those costs because they were, I guess, concerned that by supplying more people with the services, then you wouldn't be able to sustain a few individuals who would go over the 40 cap. But there was definitely internal discussion regarding like our previous expectations did not turn out to be what we expected during the pandemic. We were trying to brainstorm what reasons could be. And I think one of the things was that like now a lot of students can just do virtual meetings rather than like driving 45 minutes to a therapist's office. So I think there's a bit more flexibility and thinking about,
I'm going to ask you to take the conversation further offline just for the sake of time. And unfortunately, we do have to entertain the motion to amend. I got a motion to extend the meeting time by 15 minutes. I'm going to make this as a white motion ballot, and we already have a second. Is there any dissent to extending the time by 15 minutes to 9:45? Okay, hearing none. Motion meeting is extended to 9:45, and we're going to move on to the next functional pair, advocacy and policy. You guys are up.
I gave my update already, nothing else. Thank you.
All right, information and communication.
Yeah, just to add to what Mina and Abhinaya have shared. By the way, thank you for all of your time and effort in making this happen. we're in the process of planning an update meeting with IT, and hopefully that'll include a meeting or at least more conversation with HAA. And we're hoping to include the provost's office in either the meeting with IT or maybe individually. So all of these things are in the works, and we'll definitely keep everyone updated. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All right, and student life and community engagement.
Hey guys, I can go ahead. So we are planning a games night in collaboration with MIT and Stanford, aiming for the second week of April, I believe. But we're still trying to figure out availability of the vendor. And we're trying to make sure that we have 2 time slots so that our students who are in different time zones can make it and have, and we're trying to figure out if we will have 1 game option or multiple game options.
Thanks, guys. All right, finance and student groups.
Account balance is there. Put the reimbursement piece in the chat. Nothing else.
Nothing else from me. That should be good.
Thank you, guys. And ops.
Thank you. Very quick updates for us. We started meeting with our presidents one-on-one. Huge shout out to Abhinaya for also being on those calls really early in the morning, I should say, on behalf of the advocacy team. We'll be hopefully putting together a memo, which we'll send for information. Thanks.
Awesome. And then on my end, just wanted to let you guys know, thank you all to those who voted many, many, many times. 2 runoff sessions and 1 official voting on the amendments. We are so sorry it took that long, but we're very glad that we were able to get through everything and hear everyone's voices. Just based on the amendment, one of the ones that stuck out sort of majorly that I want to sort of bring to the table is that the number of proportional HGC reps passed in the last constitution, meaning that we are going to, the governance committee, who is scheduled to meet later this week, is going to take the student body numbers and recalculate the number of HGC reps per 500 students. One of the conversations that came up sort of in the executive circles has been how we count PhD students. PhD students will not be counted under GSAS. They will be counted under their respective home school. So if you are a PhD student in history or English, you would obviously be under GSAS. But if you are, getting your degree conferred by GSAS, but your actual PhD is in organizational behavior or marketing, you would be in HBS instead. So that changes the numbers drastically. Along the same veins of that conversation, both the proportional representation as well as all of the amendment changes that have been made so far, we've noticed that in the previous years, these constitutional changes don't get passed down to their home schools. So if your schools are picking HGC reps right now, amongst other things that are involved with the constitutional amendments, please, please, please take these amendments back to your home school so that they're fully aware of the changes that are being made. I will send a red line version with track changes on a PDF so that you guys know exactly where the changes are being made. All right, and that's all on my end. With that, are there any announcements?
Oh, I think Jojo was going to briefly mention for our elections at our next meeting, if reps would like to dress up a little bit, we're going to take a photo at the end. So just wanted to preface everyone, and please send out information for elections so we have a diverse representation of schools and programs in our elections and our executive board next year.
Yes, and as far as that, if you are thinking of running, please remember to sign up by March 31st, because that's the deadline. We just want to make sure that, if anyone wants to run, they don't forget to sign up, and then we have to figure it out right beforehand. We're still finalizing exactly what the format for elections are going to be, because we know there are people in all sorts of different time zones, but we will have that this week. The sort of elections committee is working on that. And I mentioned this in the reps chat last time. It didn't work in the spring break, but this Thursday from 11 to 1, we'll do an HGC office hour where you can feel free to just drop in, hang out, chat, very low pressure. And especially if you want to ask questions about elections, some executive board members will be there, and we can answer those in person, in as much person as we get to be as well.
Just because the point of elections was brought up, I just want to add a couple things. So first of all, Emily Mello has graciously offered her time to be the senior outgoing HGC rep who will be acting on the vote tallying along with Cinzia. So the Constitution outlines that one outgoing exec member and one outgoing HGC rep from two different schools will be the ones tallying the votes. So administratively and logistically, they'll be handling all of the conversations regarding that. As you know, with the constitutional amendments, we are now moving on to a absolute majority voting, meaning that it's not whoever gets the highest number of votes, but you need to get 50% plus one of all of the HGC reps votes in order to be elected. So if nobody gets that because there's a lot and the votes are spread out, then we are going to keep voting. And with every round of subsequent voting, the candidate with the lowest number of votes will be dropped. The last thing that I want to mention is it's very similar to our fall elections. Generally, we're supposed to have a 3-minute speech time. If we have too many candidates, we're actually going to reduce that down to 2 minutes. And then we're going to be asking the candidates to send out a short write-up about their campaign platform so that we can send it out to all the voting reps before the start of the meeting. Okay.
Yeah, and then very last thing, the president's clause, I think, right, Peter, is still in place.
Yes.
So if the reps are interested in running for the exec positions, like, please reach out to me, I guess, because I'm the only a person along with Emily who's going to be telling the votes and give you information. So yeah, please reach out to me, and then we can discuss if you have any questions, how things work. I'm happy to talk about various roles.
Yeah, with the streams of nominations that are coming in, just because you mentioned precedence clause and I have less than 2 minutes left, please remember that with the new amendment, you must have been active for 2 full semesters as an HGC rep in order to benefit from the precedence clause. So if you came in somewhere in the middle of first semester or middle of second semester, you unfortunately do not qualify to benefit from the precedence clause. I've gotten some confusions about who benefits from precedence clause. Both primary and secondary reps are considered reps in general. And now we've gotten rid of that nomenclature. So you are all reps who can benefit if you've been active for 2 semesters. And yeah, so, based on the nominations, the other thing important to note is that if you're running for president or VP, you must have been active for 1 full year term in HGC in order to run. And that's in a rep capacity or in an executive board capacity. Okay. 9:44. So we are going to end the meeting there. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motions to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Hearing seconds.
Is there any dissent? All right. If there's no dissent, meeting is adjourned at 9:44 p.m. All right. Thank you, everyone. And feel free to stick around if you want to hang out with us.